The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days.
She's not moving.
And
Leave
Adaeze
it. The
Okonkwo
car.
was still
We go.
alive. She didn't know that yet. All she knew was the cold, the blood in her mouth, and her name being called from somewhere high above her, like she was at the bottom of a well. Her car was wrapped around a tree. Through the shattered windshield, she saw 2 figures on the embankment, lit by headlights. Her husband, Emeka, his sister, Ifeoma. "She's not moving," Ifeoma said, flat, bored, like the ending had already been decided. Adaeze tried to speak. Nothing came out. "Leave it," Emeka said. "Leave the car. We go." Then she heard the car doors close, one after the other, slow, unhurried. The engine pulled away into the rain, 2 red taillights shrinking, then gone. Her own family had looked at her dying in that wreck and driven home. If you're just joining this story tonight, welcome. Hit subscribe before you go any further, because where this story is going, you will not want to miss a single moment of it. And while you settle in, tell us in the comments where in the country you're watching from tonight. Now, back to Adaeze. She did not remember much of what happened after that. There was a farmer named Baba Tunde who found her the next morning, half submerged in a drainage ditch 200 meters from the wreck, thrown clear of the car by the force of the second impact, the one nobody but her would ever know about, the one that happened when the vehicle rolled a final time after her husband and his sister had already turned their backs and walked away. Baba Tunde did not know her name. She could not tell him. Something in the crash had taken her voice for 11 days, and something in her had decided, somewhere in the white silence of the hospital ceiling above her, that she would not offer it back easily, even after it returned. Because in those 11 days of silence, Adaeze had listened. She had listened to the nurses read the newspaper aloud to a patient in the next bed, an old woman who liked to be read to, and on the 4th day she heard her own name in that reading. Adaeze Okonkwo, beloved wife and mother, tragically lost in a single-vehicle accident on the Enugu Road. A funeral had already been held. A wooden casket. She would learn later it had been filled with sandbags because there had been no body to bury. Had already been lowered into the red earth behind the family house. Her husband had already worn black. Her husband's sister had already accepted condolences on the family's behalf, standing in the doorway of the house Adaeze herself had built, greeting mourners with tea and downcast eyes. Nobody had come looking for her. Nobody, in 11 days, had come to that hospital and asked whether the unidentified woman in bed 14 might, by some mercy, be theirs. So when Adaeze finally found her voice again, she made a decision that would shape the next 4 years of her life. She did not use it to say her real name. This is the part of the story where things start to matter more than you think they do. So if this is affecting you even a little, go ahead and drop a comment below and give this video a like. It helps more than you know, and it helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. She told the hospital her name was Ada. Just Ada, common enough that no one asked questions, ordinary enough to disappear inside. She had no papers, no phone, nothing but the clothes she had been found in, and a wedding ring she quietly slid off her swollen finger and buried at the bottom of her hospital bag before anyone could ask about it. When she was well enough to be discharged, Baba Tunde, the farmer who had pulled her from the ditch, who visited her every second day with cola nut and quiet patience and never once demanded her story, offered her a room above his cassava store while she found her people. She never told him she already knew exactly where her people were. She never told him her people were the ones who had left her to die. For the first year, Adaeze told herself she was simply healing. For the second year, she told herself she was gathering strength. It was only in the 3rd year, when she had built a modest tailoring business out of nothing but a borrowed sewing machine and her own 2 ruined, scarred, unbreakable hands, when she had saved enough money to rent her own small shop in the next town over, when she had, in short, built an entire second life brick by brick without a single member of her family knowing she still drew breath, it was only then that Adaeze allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding. Why had they left her? She thought at first it might have been panic. Grief does strange things to people. Fear does stranger things still. She wanted, more than anything, to believe that Emeka had frozen in shock, that Ifeoma had simply been too afraid to look closely at a dying woman in the rain. She wanted to believe it so badly that for months she constructed excuses on their behalf, turning the memory over and over like a stone in her palm, searching for the angle that would make it forgivable. But there was one detail she could never make fit the shape of an accident. One sentence spoken in her sister-in-law's flat, unhurried voice that she replayed at night until it wore a groove into her memory. "She's not moving. Leave it. We go. We go. Not, we have to get help. Not, we have to call someone. We go." As though the outcome they were witnessing was not a tragedy to be escaped, but a task that had just been completed. It was Babatunde, of all people, who finally gave her the peace that turned suspicion into certainty. Nearly 3 years after the crash, over tea in his small kitchen, he mentioned, offhandedly, the way old men mention things that mean nothing to them but everything to someone else, that there had been talk, back when he found her, about the Okonkwo family, about how quickly the widower had remarried, about how the sister, Ifeoma, had somehow ended up managing the family's transport business that used to belong, in every way that mattered, to the dead wife. About how the life insurance had paid out within 2 months. Unusually fast, people said, for a claim with no body ever formally identified through anything but a family's word. Adaeze set down her teacup very carefully, because her hand had begun to shake, and she did not want Babatunde to see. This is the moment where the story really begins, if we're honest. Everything before this was just the wound. What comes next is what she did with it. If you've made it this far, take 30 seconds and subscribe, because you are about to watch a woman who was left for dead build the exact means of her own return. It took Adaeze another full year to prepare. She was patient in a way that grief teaches a person to be, because grief, when it does not destroy you, tends to slow your blood down until you can watch a decade pass the way other people watch a single evening. She changed her name legally to Adanwosu, a name close enough to feel like a shadow of herself, far enough to erase every trace of Adaeze Okonkwo from any document a curious relative might one day stumble across. She expanded her tailoring shop into 2 shops, then 3, quietly, under a business name that meant nothing to anyone who might have recognized her family's old reputation. She learned, through careful and untraceable means, a cousin of a cousin who worked at the local registry office, an old schoolmate who now clerked at the bank, exactly what had become of the Okonkwo family in the 4 years since her death. What she learned surprised her more than anything else in this entire ordeal. They had lost everything. Emeka's second marriage, to a younger woman named Chiamaka, whom he had wed less than 8 months after burying his dead wife, had collapsed within 2 years, and not quietly. Chiamaka had taken what remained of the insurance money in the divorce, along with the house that Adaeze herself had paid for with a decade of her own labour. Ifeoma's management of the family transport business had run it into the ground. 2 of the buses had been repossessed, a third had been sold to cover debts, and the business that Adaeze had built from 3 second-hand vehicles into a fleet of 9 now consisted of a single minibus and a mountain of unpaid loans. Emeka himself had taken to drinking, according to the cousin of a cousin, and had recently moved back into his sister's cramped 2-room flat because he could no longer afford anywhere else. The family that had once stood in the doorway of a beautiful house accepting condolences with practiced sorrow was now, 4 years later, a family with nothing left to lose. And into that ruin, Adaeze decided she would walk back through the front door. She did not plan it as revenge, not exactly, though she would be lying to herself and to you if she pretended no part of her wanted them to feel, even for a single unbearable moment, the particular horror of watching the dead return. What she told herself, in the weeks before she made the journey back to the town she had once called home, was that she simply wanted the truth spoken aloud, in front of witnesses by the people who had buried her alive in a lie. She wanted to stand in the doorway of her old life and ask the question she had swallowed for 4 years: why did you leave me there? She timed her return for a Sunday, when she knew from her sources that the extended family gathered after church at Ifeoma's flat, the flat that used to be the guest house behind Adaeze's own home, before the home itself been lost. She dressed simply. She did not want to look like a ghost seeking spectacle. She wanted to look unmistakably and undeniably like herself. She knocked on the door at exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. It was Ifeoma who opened it. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that room said a single word. Ifeoma's face did something Adaeze had spent 4 years imagining in 100 different versions, and none of her imaginings had prepared her for how close it came to physical collapse, how the colour left her sister-in-law's face so completely and so fast that for a moment Adaeze feared the woman might faint straight through the doorway. "Adaeze," Ifeoma whispered, and it was not a greeting. It was a confession, spoken by accident, the truth leaving her mouth before her mind could stop it, because in 4 years of telling everyone, including herself, that Adaeze was dead, some part of Ifeoma had clearly never quite believed her own story. We have reached the part of this story where everything is about to change, and if you're feeling even a fraction of what Adaeze felt standing in that doorway, hit like on this video right now. And tell us below, what would you have said in her place after 4 years of silence? Emeka appeared behind his sister a moment later, drawn by the sound of her voice cracking on that single word. He was thinner than Adaeze remembered, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years running from something, only to discover it has been waiting for him at the finish line the whole time. He did not speak. He simply stared, and then, slowly, sank down into the nearest chair as though his legs had been informed of something his mind had not yet caught up to. "You left me," Adaeze said. Her voice, when it finally came, was steadier than she had expected it to be, steadier, in fact, than either of theirs. "In the rain, on the Enugu Road, you looked at me and you decided I was not worth stopping for." "Adaeze, we thought." Emeka started and stopped because there was no honest way to finish that sentence, and both of them knew it. "You thought I was already dead," Adaeze said, "and you were in a hurry to make sure of it." It was Ifeoma who broke first, not with an apology, but with something far more useful to Adaeze's purposes, an accusation flung out of pure panic, the kind of thing a cornered person says only when they have stopped thinking about consequences and started thinking only about survival. "It wasn't my idea," Ifeoma said, her voice rising, cracking. "The insurance, that was Emeka's idea, not mine. He's the one who told the police you'd gone off the road alone, that no one else was in the car. He's the one who—" "Ifeoma." Emeka's voice cut across hers, sharp with warning, but it was too late. The words were already loose in the room, and Adaeze had heard every one of them. So it had not been panic. It had not been shock or fear or grief clouding good judgment in the terrible seconds after a crash. It had been a decision made together in the rain, beside a car containing a woman who was, by their own admission, spoken aloud now for the first time in 4 years, very much still alive when they chose to leave her. And that was when the second truth arrived, the one Adaeze had not been prepared for, the one that would prove far more devastating than the first. "There's something else," Ifeoma said, and her voice had dropped now, gone quiet and strange, the panic curdling into something closer to dread. "Something you don't know, about the crash, about why we were even on that road that night." If you want to know what Ifeoma said next, you're not alone. But before we get there, if this story has your full attention right now, subscribe, because what's coming is the twist this entire story has been building toward, and you do not want to walk away before you hear it. Ifeoma's hands were shaking as she spoke, and for the first time since Adaeze had walked through that door, her sister-in-law looked less like a guilty woman caught in a lie, and more like a frightened one finally setting down a weight she had carried alone for far too long. "The brakes on your car," Ifeoma said. "They didn't fail on their own, Adaeze. Someone had been in that car 2 days before the accident, someone who had access to the house, someone who knew you always drove that road on Thursday evenings." Adaeze felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she had not moved an inch. "Who?" she asked, and her own voice sounded to her like it belonged to someone standing very far away. "Emeka's business partner," Ifeoma said. Chidi, the one who financed the transport company with you back at the beginning. He came to Emeka a week before the crash and told him the company was failing, that the loans were about to come due, that the only way out was the insurance on your life, on your death. Emeka said no. I know he said no, Adaeze. I was there. I heard him refuse. But Chidi didn't need Emeka's permission. He only needed access to the car. She swallowed. When we saw the wreck that night, when we saw you in it, Emeka panicked. He thought if he called the police, if he explained everything, Chidi would say Emeka had asked him to do it, that Emeka would be blamed for the whole thing instead. So we left. God forgive us, Adaeze. We left, and we let everyone believe it was an accident, because the alternative was watching my brother go to prison for a crime he didn't commit. The man Adaeze had spent 4 years believing had left her to die because he no longer loved her enough to save her. That man, it turned out, had not orchestrated her death at all. He had simply been too much of a coward to admit, in the terror of that moment, that someone else had. It did not make what he did forgivable. Adaeze understood, standing there in that small crowded room, that cowardice and murder were not the same sin, but that hers was a wound inflicted by cowardice all the same, and a wound does not care, in the moment it is made, about the moral architecture behind the hand that made it. Still, the ground had shifted. The story she had spent 4 years building her fury around was not, it turned out, the whole story. There was another man out there, a man named Chidi, who had tampered with a car's brakes and let a woman drive to what he assumed would be her death, and who had walked free every day since, while Adaeze rebuilt her life from wreckage in a stranger's cassava store. This is where the story turns from a family's betrayal into something far more dangerous. And if your heart is racing even a little right now, that's exactly where we need you to be. Comment below and let us know. Did you see this twist coming, or did it catch you completely off guard? Adaeze did not scream. She did not weep, though some part of her understood distantly that she was entitled to. What she did instead was sit down. Ifeoma pulled a chair toward her without being asked, an unconscious act of care neither of them acknowledged aloud, and she asked in a voice gone very quiet and very still where Chidi was now. He was, as it happened, not difficult to find. Chidi Eze had not vanished into the wind after the crash. He had, with a boldness that struck Adaeze as almost admirable in its arrogance, simply continued operating in plain sight. He had used the chaos of the family's collapse, the failed second marriage, the mismanaged transport business, the family's slow public unravelling, to quietly acquire, piece by piece, the very assets that had once belonged to Adaeze. He now owned outright the last minibus that remained of her old fleet. He held the paper on the debts that had crushed Ifeoma's management of the business. In the 4 years since Adaeze's supposed death, Chidi Eze had positioned himself as the last man standing amid the ruin of a family he had personally set into motion. And no one, not Emeka, not Ifeoma, not a single soul in that town, had ever once suspected that the true architect of their downfall was the mild, helpful, endlessly patient business partner who had shown up at every family funeral, every crisis meeting, every quiet moment of grief, offering exactly the kind of assistance that made a man impossible to suspect. It took Adaeze another 6 weeks to gather what she needed. Bank records pulled with the help of the same clerk cousin who had first told her of the family's decline. A mechanic willing to testify, under the promise of anonymity, that he had once been approached by Chidi Eze about adjusting a vehicle's braking system for a price. And, most damning of all, a recorded conversation obtained with Ifeoma's reluctant but genuine cooperation, in which Chidi, believing he was speaking privately to a grieving, guilt-ridden Ifeoma about old times, said enough about the accident that solved everyone's problems to make his meaning unmistakable to anyone listening closely. Here is the moment this whole story has been leading toward, the moment justice finally has a name attached to it. If you've stayed with Adaeze this long, you deserve to see this through with her. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because we have more stories like this one coming and you will not want to miss them. The confrontation, when it came, happened not in a courtroom, but in the same modest sitting room where Adaeze had first revealed herself to her family, because Adaeze had decided, with the same patient deliberation that had carried her through 4 years of quiet rebuilding, that Chidieze deserved to feel exactly what she had felt, the specific, unbearable horror of a dead woman appearing in front of you, alive, and holding every piece of proof required to unmake your entire life. He did not confess easily. He tried at first to laugh it off as grief-stricken confusion, to suggest that Adaeze had suffered some kind of breakdown that had left her chasing shadows. But Adaeze had learned, in 4 years of rebuilding a business and a self from nothing, exactly how to be patient in the presence of a lie. She let him talk. She let him dig himself deeper into denials that grew more elaborate and more implausible with every sentence, until finally she set the recording down on the table between them and pressed play, and listened to his own voice fill the silence he had spent 4 years trying to bury. He did not go to prison that same day. These things, in the real world, take time, take lawyers, take the slow grinding machinery of a legal system that does not move at the pace of a story's climax. But the recording, combined with the bank records and the mechanic's testimony, was enough to open an investigation that Chidieze could not talk, bribe, or charm his way out of. Within 4 months, he was formally charged with attempted murder and insurance fraud. Within a year, the last of his acquired assets, the minibus, the debt he had held over the family, were seized, and, through a legal process Adaeze pursued with the same relentless patience she had once used to teach herself to walk again, restored to her. As for Emeka and Ifeoma, Adaeze did not forgive them, not fully, not in the tidy way these stories sometimes promise. What she offered them instead was something more honest, the truth spoken plainly, and the choice to live with it. She did not return to the marriage. She did not return to the house, even after it was legally hers again. She sold it and used the money to expand the tailoring business that had kept her alive when her own family had not. But she did allow Ifeoma, who had, in the end, been the one to hand her the truth even at the cost of her own brother's trust, to work for her in a small administrative role at one of her shops. A quiet penance neither woman ever spoke of directly, but both understood completely. We are almost at the end of Adaeze's story, but before we get there, this is the moment to share it, because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that being left behind is not the same as being finished. Comment below with the biggest lesson you're taking from this story and share this video with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Babatunde, the old farmer who had pulled her from a drainage ditch and asked her for nothing in 4 long years but her company over tea, was the first person Adaeze told the whole truth to, once the dust of the investigation had finally settled. He listened, as he always had, without interruption, and when she finished, he said only one thing, in the unhurried way old men have of saying things that outlast the moment they are spoken in. "You were never really dead," he told her. "You were only waiting for the right door to knock on." Adaeze thinks of that sentence often now, in the quiet hours of her tailoring shop, surrounded by the fabric and the thread and the life she built twice over, once in the dark, unseen, and once in the light, unafraid. She was left in the rain by people who believed a lie was easier to carry than the truth. She survived not because anyone came looking for her, but because she refused, in the silence of those 11 voiceless days, to let her own story end on someone else's terms. If there is a lesson in what happened to her, it is this. The people who leave you for dead are rarely as powerful as they seem in the moment they walk away. And the ones who are counted out too soon are often the very ones who come back to settle every account that was ever left unpaid. Subscribe for more stories like Adaeze's. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us below, what's the biggest lesson you're carrying with you tonight?